Alright, good evening everyone, or good morning, or afternoon, or whatever time of day it actually is. I've kind of lost track at this point. Welcome back to another episode of me Conlanging. Hope you're all faring well during these tumultuous times. And another big shout out to all of the patrons who continue to support me despite the current state of the world. So today I'm going to try to make this a shorter one, although it is actually really surprisingly difficult to tell how long the edited video is actually going to end up being. Because sometimes I have really quite a relatively productive session and get, 45 minutes to an hour worth of decent footage, whereas other times it's only like 25 minutes, half an hour. But going forward, I'm going to try and make these videos a little bit shorter, which will make them easier to edit, and hopefully means that I can do them more often as well, because otherwise this conlang will just never get done. So with that being said, let's see, where were we? Yeah, so starting out with a couple items of follow-up. Yeah, first of all, last time I put the vowels in, but I didn't put in the long vowels, for some reason. So I just went ahead and did that before recording, and you'll notice what I did with the central vowel. I decided to do what I did with ilothwy, where the short central vowel is the schwa, but the long central vowel is It retains the high quality when it's long. And next, so you'll remember last time I was having immense trouble deciding what should go on the auxiliary verb and what should go on the lexical verb, but after thinking about it, I have decided that yes, it does make more sense for the passive and the causative to go onto the lexical verb, because they relate more to the semantic content of the verb than the actual tense and aspect stuff that goes on the auxiliary. And speaking of which, a commenter by the name of HH pointed out to me that it actually makes a lot more sense for negation to go on the lexical verb, because I had it on the auxiliary because I thought it's negating the action of the verb, so it would go on the main verb, which I guess is feasible, but at the same time, once again, if we think about how these things evolved, the auxiliary originally evolved from a copula. So if you just make a sentence like, I wasn't going, if the negation goes on the auxiliary, you could kind of translate that as, I was not while going to the shop. And if you want to take it even further than that, you remember these copulae evolved from a verb of posture and the verb to live, respectively. So if you negate the auxiliary, that would be like, I was not sitting while going to the shop, which sounds kind of weird. And it would make a lot more sense if you negated the lexical verb, because it would be like, I was sitting while not going to the shop, because you're negating the to-go part. That makes a lot more sense to me. So, I'm going to move negation down here. The only alternative to that I can think of is if, in addition to the locative copula and the copula, if there was a distinct negative verb that means to not be. But of course, that would only have two forms, which means that the negative would have fewer tenses. That's actually kind of an interesting idea. So let's say there used to be this word that meant to not be. So the imperfective form in the proto-language, the unmarked form, would just be the nomic, right? It's just a general state of being. It is not. Whereas, in the perfective form, that emphasizes completion, so it just would have been like a perfect or a past or, was not. But then the converb forms get involved, so if it gets combined with a lexical verb that's in the imperfective converb, that adds a continuous aspect to it. So it's like, am not being. That would be like a negative present. And then same with the perfect if that's just sort of in fact, it wouldn't even really be a perfect, we'll just call that generic past. And then with the imperfective, that would be a past continuous, which we'll just call an imperfect. And then with the perfective converb, that adds the completed aspect, so that would give us the new perfect. But then if that's the case, what would happen with the past? Would it stay as a generic past? Or would it do something weird, like turn into a subjunctive? I don't know about that. And then the perfective of the perfective would be a pluperfect, surely. But then what about the future? Would there just not be a negative future? That doesn't seem right. Well, back in the days of the proto-language, the future came from using what would become the locative copula. If the locative copula gets affixed onto the negative to form the future negative, so then with the imperfective that would be the future, and with the perfective that would be future of the past, which is what happened, if I remember correctly. Yes, that's what happened there, which became the conditional. So we'd have a negative conditional. I don't know if I'm going to keep that. I kind of like the idea, but at the same time, even if I do go for that, I can still see there being some sort of negative manifesting on the lexical verb as well, just for purposes of the scope of negation. Because if you imagine, before these auxiliary verb constructions became mandatory, if you had a sentence like, I saw my friend when I wasn't feeling well, if that's the case, then the main verb clause, saw my friend, is positive polarity, whereas the thing that's negated is the converb clause, not feeling well. The negative would manifest in some form on that clause too. But if that was the case, then which negation strategy would be dominant? Would this just be dropped? Well, it all kind of gets back to another point that HH brings up. It all kind of depends on what these forms actually are, because I've been calling them converbs this whole time, but as I kind of alluded to, they're not necessarily converbs. They're just non-finite forms. Are these actually converbs, or are they participles? That is, are they adverbs that modify the auxiliary verb, or are they participles that modify the subject? I'm picturing these things as being used kind of like participles are in Latin, but in Latin, participles have to agree with the nouns they modify in case, number, and gender, which I definitely don't want to do with these, especially if I'm doing noun-like adjectives, which I'm leaning towards because I tend to rely on verb-like adjectives too often. Then again, I did say, yes, here it is, I did say maybe I would do noun-like attributive adjectives and verb-like predicative adjectives, which means that since these are going to be more often than not the complement to an auxiliary verb, then they would usually be verb-like, unless you actually wanted to use them to modify a noun. I think I prefer them being consistently verb-like, so I might go ahead and actually say, yes, they are converbs, in the true sense. Meanwhile, for this one, I called it an infinitive. It might be just a verbal noun gerund type thing, and I'm fine with that because it won't be used as a converb in the same way that these ones are. Yeah, I'm going to move forward saying that these are converbs, and that's a noun. In which case, having this negative form, although it's kind of cool, I don't think that would make very much sense. So I'm going to still leave it there to just remind me there's some stuff that I want to do with stative verbs that might be useful for, so I'm going to keep it there and come back to it later. Another thing I was struggling with last time was what system I wanted to use for anaphora. Now, I was toying around with the idea of a gender system, and I kept going back and forth between having a small number of genders or having a large number of genders, and the more I thought about it, I don't know why, but I'm really not feeling gender for this language. Well, I mean, I kind of do, because I did that in Okolawak, but beyond that, I don't know. Even though it would kind of help me make more forms for the auxiliary verb, which I want, it still just doesn't feel right for some reason. Especially since if we do that and we're having noun-like adjectives, then that means that the adjectives would probably have to agree in gender with the nouns they modify, and then there'd be all this, I don't know, I just really can't be bothered with that. So, I think I'm gonna scrap that, and instead, I am actually going to bring back obviation, because I'd initially dismissed obviation as an option because the whole thing with obviation is there's the distinction between proximate and obviate, and since in this system we're using all of these valency changing operations to keep the most salient argument as the subject, then that, I thought, would be like the primary mechanism of encoding the information structure. But I read a couple of papers about obviation in the Algonquin languages, and it's seemingly not quite as one-to-one as I thought, because you can apparently have sentences where the obviate, which usually is the thing that's considered less salient, is still the subject. And I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around exactly how the two interface with each other, but I'm a lot more comfortable with the idea of using obviation than gender. And another thing, I mentioned that I used obviation in Nakachti and in Ilothwi, but in both of those languages, obviation is only marked on the verb, whereas in the Algonquin languages, obviation is also marked by a suffix on nouns. And I'm thinking, this language seems to be pretty fusional, what with the non-concatenative morphology, etc. And if I were to do gender, then it would feel an awful lot like Latin, where nouns took a suffix for case, number, and gender and all that. But if I were to do obviation, then nouns would take a suffix that agreed with case, number, and obviation. How often do you see that? That's kind of cool. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and throw in an obviate distinction. So we have third proximate, third obviate. We'll go ahead and throw in an inanimate. Now there are some languages that are reported to have something called a further obviate, where they have 2 degrees of obviation, but I don't understand enough about how that works, and I don't think we need to go that far. And if I wanted more forms, I could do an indefinite person or an impersonal form. An indefinite person would be like when the subject of the verb is unknown, like somebody does something, which kind of overlaps with the impersonal, which is like when you say it's raining. In English we say it, because that's just the best we can do, really. That's kind of a dummy subject pronoun. And while we're at it, I might want to go ahead and actually throw in that inclusivity distinction. And for second person, maybe we could have a formality distinction. Because the standard thing to do for formality with second person pronouns is just to make it plural. Happens in loads of languages. In Nahuatl, it's actually kind of interesting because the second person singular subject verb form is identical to the first person plural verb form. The only difference is that the first person plural has a suffixed glottal stop. And that's because originally the pronoun we was used to mean a formal you. Like to say, do you want something? To be formal, you would say, do we want something? And then that happened so often that the actual verb form incorporated the we pronoun, which I just think is really neat. So in this case, just to keep things interesting and to give us some more forms, we could say originally there was a second-person pronoun whose plural form was used for formality. But then the plural form became a standard singular formal form, and then some other plural strategy evolved, like maybe pluractionality? And that would give us a distinct second-person informal and formal verb forms. I quite like that. That's something to play around with. That's kind of cool. See? Loads of forms. We don't need gender. So that, then, is the auxiliary. Meanwhile, for the lexical verb, we got these 4 different forms. Now, I have done ample research since the last episode on the circumstantial voice and how other Austronesian alignment systems work, and I still don't really understand the specifics of the circumstantial voice and how that comes about. But looking at a whole bunch of different systems, number one, it seems that the circumstantial voice is just used as a catch-all term, because a lot of systems will have, like a benefactive and instrumental voice, and then they'll also have the circumstantial voice, which is for everything else. Or they'll have the locative and instrumental and then a circumstantial, or sometimes just a circumstantial, like in Malagasy. So I'll add circumstantial, and there's just like an everything else form. But also, looking at these systems, sometimes the different forms, the different voices, are pretty transparently related to each other. I mean, there's a lot of variation between different systems, but sometimes they involve like a circumfix, and one of the elements, either the prefix or the suffix, will be the same between different forms, things like that, which makes me think that the most likely path, and the easiest way to do it, would be to just use the passive in combination with these applicatives. Oh, and something I got wrong last time. The adjudicative, from what I can tell, is actually just another name for the instrumental voice, or it's the mechanism by which the instrumental voice is expressed, because it's like the subject helps to carry out the action, or the subject is used to carry out the action. So like in Blackfoot, you can't have inanimate subjects, so instead of saying the knife cut the bread, you say the knife was used to cut the bread, and that was used bit would be an adjudicative, I think. So it's just a way of taking the instrument and promoting it to the subject. And another thing I forgot, reflexives, and also reciprocals. And while I'm at it, a detransitive, or antipassive, or whatever you want to call it. Basically just something that obfuscates the object. So like in Nahuatl, if you have a transitive verb like qua, which is to eat, you could say something like Nikwa in Tlaxcalli, I eat the tortilla, where the verb nikwa is the ni prefix is first person singular. The first element of that geminate k is the third person singular object, and then the verb is qua. So since qua is transitive, it always requires an object prefix. But if you want, you can use the indefinite non-human object prefix to make nitlaqua, and that means I eat something. It's like the object is no longer necessary, which is kind of similar to an antipassive, because it makes an intransitive verb out of a transitive verb while keeping the agent the same. And in fact, it's quite similar to this, the indefinite or impersonal subject, except it's an indefinite or impersonal object. In fact, could these two even be related? Could they be the same affix? So like whatever this affix is, if it goes on the auxiliary, then that obfuscates the subject. If it goes on the lexical verb, it obfuscates the object. That's kind of cool. So every lexical verb would have these 4 forms. Now the passive would contrast with the applicatives. Actually, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the possessive voice, because that would involve a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't particularly want to get into. We could do what Hebrew does, where we could have the active, the passive, and the reflexive, which would then contrast with all of those. Oh, and speaking of Hebrew, another thing to think about. Intensives. I really like intensives because they're very useful for derivation. And those would almost certainly go on the lexical verb because they're intensifying the semantic meaning. But that's more derivation than actual inflection that we're talking about here, so I'll leave that there for now. Now, if the adjudicative is the same thing as the instrumental applicative plus the passive, we could just get rid of that. But also, I can see the adjudicative evolving just in one step if we have the verb to help, because that's basically what the adjudicative means. Like, if I wanted to say, I used the knife to cut the bread, I could make the instrument the subject by saying, the knife helped me to cut the bread. Or you could even keep the bread as the direct object and say, the knife helped cut the bread for me. So then, help would just become an affix onto the verb. So we could do the adjudicative in one step. But then could you have an adjudicative passive? The bread was helped to be cut with the knife for me? Does that work? Man, that's confusing. I think for now I might just stick with what I know and just go with these constructions. So we said the instrumental and the comitative are the same. Now if we've got the reflexive here, then where do reciprocals come in? We could say that the reciprocal is the same as the reflexive except with some other extra bit of morphology on it. So reflexives usually come from some word that indicates the self. Like very often it's head or body or something like that. I do know that in Mohawk the reciprocal is formed by the reduplication of the reflexive prefix, which is pretty cool. Or, instead of having it be a passive, it could be a middle voice or a mediopassive. And it could be that the mediopassive, unless an overt agent was stated, it would be interpreted as a reflexive. So like, I see in the mediopassive on its own would be interpreted as I see myself, but then if you included some other argument in whatever case that would be, it would be like I am seen by such and such. But I would kind of like there to be a way to express a passive sentence without an agent. Maybe the reflexive is some affix that occurs on the mediopassive stem. And then the reciprocal could also be on the mediopassive stem. Or it could be, to make it symmetrical, we could make it on the active stem. So the reciprocal usually comes from some sort of term that means each other, or one another, or something like that, which I could see either being mediopassive or active. I kind of like that system. Let me know what you think of that, because I might go with that. I might also actually go ahead and add ablative applicative in there as well, because I know ubich has an ablative applicative, or is it Ainu? It might be Ainu. One of those two, because I can see that being very useful. Still don't know what to do with the adjudicative. And as for the causative, so the causative would be compatible with any of these, right? Because you could have, say, the bread was given to her, but you could also make it causativized to make the bread was made to be given to her by me. So you could causativize any of these, but the causative is also compatible with the passive. So the causative, like the intensive, would just be its own sort of thing. that would contrast with all of these. And so would negation as well. Then there's the circumstantial, which still don't really get. I'll just add that up there, because maybe I'll have like a general applicative thing that's used for just any assorted oblique argument. Still don't know what to do with the adjudicative. And the detransitive. The detransitive removes the object. Could you have a passive detransitive? So a detransitive would be like, I see something. But then if you passivize that, would that be, I was seen by something? Could it be that if you use the detransitive with the active, so I see something, that would just be your straight up detransitive. But if you used the detransitive with the mediopassive, could that give you a true passive? Because that would completely obfuscate the argument, right? Well, I'm actually pretty pleased with that, and I'm coming to the end of the time that I allotted myself for this one. So I think I'll leave things there for now. So, thank you guys very much for watching, and let me know what you would think about me making these videos shorter and more often, because I don't want to, spam your feed with these videos, but at the same time I don't want them to be overly long, so I'm trying to kind of find the right balance. So let me know your thoughts on that, and of course let me know what you think about these various decisions that I've made throughout this episode, and I will see you next time.